iron in their soul.
What's up, YouTube? This is Iron and Soul, back today with another very important message. Please subscribe to my channel, like this video, share this video, leave a comment, let me know what you think about my content. In addition to that, please feel free to follow me over on Instagram at TheKingJabez. It will be greatly appreciated. Well, man, let's do some work. Let's talk about an important subject matter today, and that is polygamy. Is polygamy for today? So we're going to look at what's happening in our current world and culture. But before we do that, let's go back and look at the ancient Hebrews and the purpose of polygamy in their day, and why kings like Solomon, David, and others practiced this during their lifetime. Lamech is the first man mentioned to marry two wives. This is found in Genesis 4:19. And so we look at the ancient Hebrews, the very first time this is mentioned, in the very beginning. So we think about the purpose for this. In patriarchal societies, single women could not provide for themselves. Okay, so women in those days were unskilled. They were not given access to higher learning or education. So they were dependent upon a man. Whether this man was a father, a brother, an uncle, or a husband. And in some cases, it was being a second wife. And though it wasn't an ideal situation, for the women, it protected them from the treachery of that day. And basically, women who did not have a husband, a father, an uncle, a brother, or some man to provide for them were often subject to the brutality of slavery as well as prostitution. And so this is a very solid reason as to why God allowed this in the Old Testament, though it was never God's main way. Okay, God's way, according to Scripture, is one man, one woman, period. That's the bottom line with that. But because of the nature of men and women and mankind, human nature, doing what is contrary to what God says, there had to be some type of system established to protect women who were very vulnerable in those days. With that being said, it was really never an ideal situation. Even considering all of that, we look at men like Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon, just those four men. Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon. We look at all four of their lives, and polygamy, to be honest, was a nightmare. You know, of course, the men, as a man, they enjoyed the sexual pleasure that came with that, of course. But look at their family dynamics. There was constantly family feuds with people, and you think about something like this, every time people talk about polygamy, people never think about how that affected the children. Because you look at Jacob, you know, his kids were bumping heads. You know, one kid felt more important than the other. This one felt like he wasn't being taken care of. So that naturally created this strife. And it created a hatred for their own siblings. And this is exactly what happened with the Hebrew Joseph, who was bumping heads with his brothers. And the reason for that is because Jacob loved Joseph more than the other sons. And the reason he loved Joseph more is because he loved the mother more. So I don't care what a man says. If a man has one wife or two wives, three wives, four wives, I'm convinced at the end of the day, a man has at least one woman who has his heart. That's just the way we're wired. Right? He has that one who he really cares about, that he really loves. And in Jacob's case, this was his wife, Rachel. He cared more about Rachel than the other wives and everyone else in their family, to a degree. So let's kind of break this down, look at it piece by piece, and look at, first of all, Abraham. So in Bible days, men would have wives and also a woman who was referred to as a concubine. This is kind of like a second wife, and didn't have the status and the wealth and influence of the main wife. So in the case of Father Abraham, he had Sarah, who was his wife, and Hagar was Sarah's handmaid or servant, or in some translations, she was the slave of the family. So he had a son by both of these women. He had Isaac, who became the heir, of course, through Sarah, and then he had Ishmael through Hagar. And we know from that particular account that there was strife between Sarah and Hagar, as well as Isaac and Ishmael. So first example of this I'm using today, we see what? We see conflict between those two women, and we see conflict between the two boys. And this was pretty consistently the case. For all you guys who want to have multiple wives, and if you're looking at this, first of all, before we get into current culture, because I'm going to get there eventually, stick with me. We'll take this from ancient Hebrew days to eventually modern day 2022, 23. And so, looking at that ancient Hebrew account, we have to look at this honestly and say from Abraham, David, Solomon, and Jacob, those 4 men in particular, there was always strife between the women as well as the children. And so we see that with Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac, and we definitely saw this with King David. King David is another one who had multiple wives, and there was some serious beef between the children of King David. Let's break this down. King David had 8 wives, and one of those wives was a woman named Bathsheba. Bathsheba was, of course, another man's wife. So we see David here committing adultery. David also committed, not necessarily murder himself, but he had a man set up to be murdered. He ordered to hit, to be honest, by making sure they placed him on the front line in battlefield and removing support from the other soldiers from this man. And so he made sure that the husband of Bathsheba died in battlefield. Uriah is his name. And Uriah was a righteous man. He was an upright man. And here's an example again of how sometimes you can really get hurt out here in the world as a righteous man, doing the right thing. There are always men in power sometimes that can really cause you some problems. And that's a separate message in itself on how we got to be careful out here. We got to definitely play chess in this world. There's so much evil out here, and there are people who have the power to hurt you. And you have to be wise enough to navigate around that and to protect yourself and your family as well. There were some serious problems between the children, the sons and daughters of King David. Of course, Solomon was born of Bathsheba, which was another man's wife before David took her. And they had other sons. Of course, if he had multiple wives, that means there were half brothers, half sisters. So David had a daughter named Tamar. And Tamar had a half brother, which means they had different mothers, named Amon. And her brother with the same mother was Absalom. It's kind of confusing, but we got to break this down. So you have her brother with the same mother, Absalom, and then you have her half-brother, Amon. Well, the half-brother, Amon, was lusting after Tamar. So much so that he eventually took it from her. Using my words carefully for YouTube. And so, when this happened, of course, her full brother, Absalom, did not like it. Rightfully so. And what made it even worse is that King David didn't do anything about it. So, Absalom, giving a story here, breaking it down for you, played possum for 2 years. And the scripture says he didn't say anything about it, good or bad. So though he was quiet for 2 whole years, we know men, he was mad the whole time. He was just waiting for his opportunity. When people have certain beefs, they'll wait for years to manifest what they really think about you. People will hold a grudge and anger, a murderous hatred for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So this is a warning for you too. Just because someone's quiet around don't mean they're on your side. They might be sitting around hating you the whole time and looking for opportunity to hurt you. So when you see someone clearly doesn't like you or is hateful or jealous, stay away from that person. Let me give you that piece real quick too. Stay away from that person. They're dangerous, and they're, in many cases, waiting for the opportunity to do some harm to you. So, that being said, Absalom had Amon murdered at a party. This is a house party, a family party. They're over there, at the house party, having a good time. All the brothers and sisters. This is the king's children. So, of course, this is a really nice house, really nice food, clothes, the most probably well-known guests in the nation at that point. This was a top class or first class type party, And right in the midst of that, Absalom gives the order to one of his servants and says, kill him. And he killed Amon. We know, of course, that didn't sit well with King David. And so David was angry with Absalom about that. Absalom had to literally run for his life and leave for a couple of years. He eventually came back. And this was because of one of David's soldiers who kind of organized this and orchestrated this for there to be some type of reconciliation between Absalom and King David. But there was still beef. And that manifests some time later when Absalom finally made the decision to try to take the throne from King David. He was spending time campaigning, talking to the servants in the community, telling people if I was king, I would do things this way, basically drummed up support for himself. And it was easy for him to do that because, for one, he was the king's son. And the scripture says that Absalom was the most handsome man in the entire nation of Israel. So you got all these Hebrews. Absalom looked the best out of everybody. So you got this young man, painting the picture here, who was very handsome, long hair. We know that from scripture. He had really long hair that he only trimmed once a year. You know what I mean? By the way, God's not against men having long hair. Let me put that out there too for you legalists. Absalom had really long hair. He was a handsome young man in power. And he's a great example of what happens when a father, because we're talking about polygamy, right? When a father doesn't deal with issues within the family. And so eventually there was a beef between David and Absalom. Absalom tried to take over the throne. And unfortunately, Absalom was murdered in that battle and lost his life. And so we see how a lot of this stuff happened because of David's original sin, taking this man's wife from him, taking the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. And when he did that, the prophet told David, the sword will never leave your house, which means that you will have problems in your family for the rest of your life. And that's exactly what happened. This is the other side of polygamy that no one talks about. So having said that, let's now talk about his son, Solomon. Well, Solomon took it to the next level. According to 1 Kings 11:3, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which is essentially like a second wife. So he literally had 1,000 women who was under his household. Of course, granted, he was the richest man who ever lived. So he had the resources, he had the money and wealth to take care of that many women. But nevertheless, that type of lifestyle led him away from God. And from my study and research, eventually, Solomon was involved in false religion, the occult, bound down to false gods, even bringing these false gods into the nation of Israel. And so that lust and desire for all these women, these foreign women, eventually led Solomon to a place where he was dishonoring God and practicing false religion, as wise as he was. So it led to a path of regret. It led to a path of looking back on life and realizing that he had everything that wasn't worth it. And I think eventually Solomon did get it together. He got back on the right track, and his wisdom and his relationship with God was restored. He always had the wealth. It's like the message I did recently about the wealth, wisdom, war, wealth, worship, and women. Solomon had all of that. But unfortunately, with that last part of that message, the women, he took it to an extreme, and this led him to a place of rebellion, a place of the occult, false religion, sexual soul ties, and so many sins that I caution you guys against who listen to my content over here on Iron and Soul. And last but not least, we have Jacob. So we have Abraham, David, King Solomon, and Jacob. So Father Abraham, these are all pillars in the Hebrew nation of Israel. The Hebrews, the nation of Israel, the people of God. So we have Father Abraham, who was the father of the Jewish or Hebrew nation. We have King David, who was the best king possibly in Israel's history. We have Solomon, who was the wealthiest and richest. And we have Jacob, who was the father of these 12 tribes. Right? So we have all of these legendary men from our faith. And we look at their lives, and these multiple women, truthfully, were not really good for any of them. I think Abraham was a little bit off than the rest of them, but we see definitely with David, Solomon, and Jacob, it was a mess. So let's talk about Jacob now. We talked about it briefly, so let me go into a little more detail. Jacob, of course, had 12 sons, which, of course, eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. Multiple wives. And from this created a lot of family jealousy, strife. And Jacob did something that a lot of the fathers, by the way, should not do. You got to be careful, fathers, showing favoritism with your children. And I have to be careful with them myself, too. We have children we sometimes gravitate to more than others. And we got to be careful with that because the kids notice that. And so we have to be very intentional as men to not do that, because that can create some very deep wounds within the mind psychology of a child. So if you are a father listening to this, do not show favoritism. Even though it's hard to do that, we all kind of have our favorites, kind of just human nature, the way it is. You got to be careful with that. Jacob had 4 wives and 13 children. We talked about 12 boys, 1 girl. His 1 girl was also forced into a sexual act, to make it lightly. And, you know, from that led to rage from her brothers. Her brothers went to town, ended up killing some people, took their stuff, took their women. So Jacob had a lot of pain with his children. From his daughter being taken advantage of, to the sons retaliating and murder in robbery, taking the money, taking women, taking wives, to the jealousy between the brothers and Joseph, and eventually selling Joseph into slavery. Can you imagine your own brothers selling into slavery? What? We can't imagine that. We're from Africa. We can imagine that. That's what happened to us. That's why we're here in America. Sorry, not sorry. So, that happens. And I know some of y'all mad at me. You felt, okay, honestly, you went there. Yeah, I went there. I mean, couldn't help it. It came to my mind as I talk about this. Like, I can't imagine this. I'm sitting here as an African in America right now. Duh. So, that happens. And part of that was jealousy, and hatred and greed. And this, in part, was because of the multiple wives, different mamas. Some mamas getting treated better than the other mama. Because that's what's going to happen in many cases. This mother get treated better. The husband likes this woman more. He liked Rachel more than he liked the other 3 women. Okay? And the boys saw that in the way that Joseph was treated. He had a special coat made of many colors that the other brothers didn't have. So he got better clothes, probably got better food, more privileges. So, of course, the brothers felt the way about that. And that was Jacob's fault. And so, again, this is the other side of polygamy that people don't talk about. The hatred it creates amongst the siblings. That can eventually, and we look at all these lives with, Jacob, David in particular, Abraham, it led to, in some cases, murder. It led to the sexual exploitation of some of the women. It led to hatred amongst brothers, feuds, slavery. There was a lot that happened behind these men having multiple wives. So when we talk about this, like this is so glorious, you need to read the whole story. It was not glorious. It was a mess in almost every situation. So that's my take on that. Now, let's transition now to modern day 2023. Culture today. According to my research, there are like 60,000 people who practice polygamy in the U.S. It is illegal. Polygamy is illegal in every state in America from my research. But we know people are still practicing it indirectly. Of course, not by marrying multiple women, but by having multiple women. So though a man today in America won't marry 5, 6 women, he'll have one he marries and he has kids with 3 or 4 other women. You see this all the time on social media, in the black community, white community. So there are a lot of men right now who are polygamous. They're just not doing it legally, if that makes sense. So they got one wife, and they got like 4 or 5 side chicks, and got kids with all of them, and they're creating these huge families of 10 to 15 children, such as NBA Youngboy, for example, Nick Cannon. And it seems like at some point that's where Blueface is going to be going to, to be honest. My thing with this is if your goal is to have a lot of kids, great. Pray for one healthy woman, righteous woman, good-looking woman, who you can have 6 to 10 kids with. I met a family in Minnesota. I ain't got a story for everything. This is probably every bit of let's say about 9, 10 years ago. I met a family in Minnesota, from Minnesota rather, not in Minnesota, but from Minnesota, who came to Chicago where I was working to non-for-profit. They were there volunteering. I met the family that liked me and my wife, so they invited us to their home in Minnesota. So we went up there to visit them on a bus, and we stayed there for like 2, 3 days. Well, this family, I think they had every bit of 10 or 11 children. And some of the children were like 18. I think one of them was in the military. One of the girls was working. I think she was working at a hospital. She had some of them were in grade school. Some of them were as little as 3, 4 years old. One was a baby. You get my point. So I have seen firsthand. Of course, Dad had a good job too. He had a good job somewhere. He was making good money to take care of that many children in a nice size home. So there's nothing wrong. Let me put this out there with a man wanting to have a beautiful woman and multiple children. If that's what you want, great. But of course, understand that with that, you're going to need a really good job. So if you're looking at having, 6 to 12 children, then you need to be looking at how you're going to be making $100,000 a year or more. Okay, how am I going to get myself in that top 10% of earners in America? Or I'm not sure what the statistics are in other countries, so I can't speak on that. What it may be in the UK or Europe or anything else, I don't know. But here in the States, you're looking at having at least 100K. We're talking, pocket wise, taking home $1,400 a week, at least. You know what I mean? With that amount of children. And so, that's not a bad thing. Having a solid, good job to support the family of that size is a good thing. Having a goal to have generational wealth and build a legacy on earth, that's great. I don't have a problem with any of that. In fact, You know, between you guys, I got 3 kids right now. I wouldn't mind having a couple more kids, due time. I'm a healthy man. I can have kids for a while. And before it's all said and done, to be honest with you, I guess iron shit my heart real quick. I wouldn't mind having 3 more, to be honest. I wouldn't mind having 6 to 10 kids. I think it's a blessing to have multiple kids if you have attention to be faithful to that woman and to raise those children and to do what's necessary to give them a good life. That's great. That's to me, that's an honorable thing to do. This is one of the reasons why I have so much respect for my grandfather. My grandfather worked hard, steel mill for 32 years, made good money, laying train tracks and welding, working like a dog, 10, 12-hour shifts for years, decades, to raise those 6 children, who of course became my uncles, aunties, and my father. So I have much respect for my grandfather for doing that, and any man who is willing to take on the responsibility of raising and supporting a wife and several children. That's great. The problem is when you go about it the wrong way and you do it just for the perspective of just lust or desire to have multiple women, in some cases not take care of the kids, that's one thing. So if you are a man who wants to do this for the purpose of building a legacy and having multiple children and leaving your mark upon the earth, by all means do that. I would just suggest you do it with one woman, right? That would be my humble suggestion to you, is to find one healthy woman who you love, who you can build that family unit with of 10 to 12 children, if that's what you want. By all means, if that's your goal, go for it. Iron and Soul has nothing to say about that. That's between you and God. So guys, that's my take. I'm sure some will appreciate this, some will not. Some will be offended. Others will agree with what I said, and I'm okay with that. This is kind of a difficult talk, somewhat controversial, depending on who listens to this. And so those are just a few thoughts. Okay, we can add more layers to this. We can do a part 2 if we need to. If you have more questions, or you guys, by the way, leave a comment. By all means, share a comment, give your experience or your thoughts on this, create some dialogue. Thanks for listening to this talk. God bless. Stay strong. Peace.